How could you turn your passion for creative writing into providing an income? Also, how difficult is it to make that leap from full-time employment to doing it as a profession? We'll hear of a great example of this today. Welcome to Half Hour Mentor. My name is Ian Cleverden and welcome to the audio podcast series designed to help anyone who's looking for inspiration to develop their creative skills, whether that's professionally or as a hobbyist. Just like Series 2, this one focuses on various aspects of the creative arts. I shall be interviewing musicians, songwriters, authors and actors, but also speaking to some in the directing and strategic management fields of this wide-ranging industry. All of my guests have been carefully chosen, as each one of them has an interesting backstory from which we can all learn. If you're new to the series, please follow it on whichever streaming platform you use and go back to have a listen to the rich archive of around 30 interviews and compilations. This episode is a first in the history of the podcast series, as it's the first of two parts. My guest today is best-selling author and scriptwriter Paul Finch. I'm a fan of Paul's books, as you'll hear, and when I sat down with him to talk about his career to date and how he got into writing, his advice and his backstory was so interesting, I decided halfway through recording our chat that this would need to be a two-parter. Paul is an ex-policeman and journalist turned best-selling author. He first cut his literary teeth penning episodes of the TV series The Bill and has written extensively for horror and fantasy, including for Doctor Who. He's also known for his crime novels, or urban thrillers as he likes them to be known, of which there are 12 to date, including the Heckenberg and the Claiborne series. Most recently, he's released a historical novel, Usurper, based in England around 1066. I met with him at his home in Lancashire, England, to talk about his extensive and varied career. In this first of two parts, we talk about his journey from working for Greater Manchester Police to becoming a full-time professional writer, and the huge influence his father, Brian, had on his creative writing skills. This series is completely independent and ad-free, so if you like what you hear and you'd like to help support the production costs, especially the studio coffee supply, please feel free to donate what you can via the Corona Sound website. A link can be found in the show notes. Let's hear from Paul. Paul Finch, welcome to Half Hour Mentor.
Thanks, Ian.
Go back to your teenage years. What did you want to do as a job or a career?
I wanted to be a copper.
Right.
Well, I mean, before I was a teenager, I wanted to be an archaeologist. I know what a strange thing for a pre-teen person to want to do, but
why was that?
I was fascinated by dinosaurs, and I thought that it would be great fun digging up dinosaur bones. As I grew older, and I don't know why things changed, I just became fascinated by the idea of the police officer. That stuck with me into my adult years because that's what I became.
Right.
That was my first job.
What specifically was it that made you think you wanted to join the police?
Well, it wasn't that I had an officious streak. That was what one of my uncles said. Well, I never knew you had an officious streak. I don't know, I was just quite in... I think, to be honest with you, there was a bit of... I probably had a bit of a romantic idea of what being a copper was. I saw... to me, it wasn't, as a young, naive person, it wasn't going to be about walking the beat and having a word in people's ear, which is what the reality of policing is or should be. It was about being, a detective and driving around and investigating murders and all that kind of thing. Probably a very naive viewpoint. I certainly never sat there and thought, wow, I can't wait to do all that paperwork.
Which you soon found out.
Which I soon found out was exactly what most of it was. But once you set on a course, you set on a course, and the idea... I mean, I wouldn't say I was from the age of 14... absolutely bent on becoming a copper, but it was always there. It was always something I was quite interested in. I mean, I probably dabbled with all kinds of ideas about what I wanted to be, but that was the thing that was still there when I finished my education, so that's what I went for.
Did you go straight into the police?
Yeah. I didn't. I mean, apart from summer jobs, I didn't do any. That was my first actual job. As an adult, and it was a strange introduction to the working world. It was very different from anything I expected.
So tell us about that then. What were your experiences? Where were you based?
I was based in Salford. I was in Greater Manchester Police. I was based in Salford. Now, I should make this clear from the beginning. I wasn't a career copper. I'm now old enough to have done 30 years and retired. I didn't. I only did a few years. I did a wide range of duties, from uniform to plain clothes, detective work to walking the beat, traffic, all these kinds of things. You never know what's going to happen day to day in the police. So you have to be a bit of a jack of all trades. That side of it was very exciting. The downside, and this might be the segue we need into the writing game. I had sometimes it could be really, really depressing. One of the problems with any emergency services role is that you tend to be dealing every day with people who are having the worst day of their lives.
Right.
So the stress just from interacting with people who are suffering can be high. Now, yes, doctors and nurses get it, firemen get it, ambulance drivers get it. It's not by any means unique to the police, but you go from one situation to another wherein people are very highly stressed, very upset. Sometimes they're sort of mortally upset. They might be bereaved or whatever. And
you're still a first responder, though,
You're
aren't
a first responder. Young coppers are first responders. So you're the first at a crime scene. You might be the first at a murder scene. I was on a number of occasions. I mean, a child murder is a particularly difficult thing to deal with. Thankfully, I didn't have too many of those, but, one is enough. All these things are there which can make your life very hard. And you don't complain because that's your job. But I was increasingly aware throughout my time in the police that my dad had been a writer. 4 generations of British television his career eventually spanned. And he did a lot of work at Granada. And I remember as a youngster going with him to Granada to watching them filming episodes of Coronation Street, being introduced to people like Ken Dodd and Frankie Howard,
right,
and even Charlie Caroli. I don't know if you remember him.
Yes,
he was a comedian from way back. He used to have a sort of clown outfit on.
Used to be at Blackpool.
That's correct. Yeah. He did. It was at Blackpool Tower where I met him, actually. Blackpool Tower Circus. Oh, that must be about 1968, 69. I was a kid then. But we did a lot of... I met a lot of people, and the sort of razzmatazz of that world. I mean, Granada was a really productive independent television company. It was a terrible loss, really, when it disappeared. And it was a great place to visit. But I didn't have any... While I didn't have any ambitions to be part of that world, it certainly had an effect on me. And while I was in the police, I was starting to develop an interest in actually writing stuff, in writing fiction. Inevitably it was going to be cop fiction. I mean, I'd seen television shows like The Sweeney, which were very different from previous shows like Dixon of Dock Green. I mean, The Sweeney was more like an American-style cop thriller, which was much sexier to an impressionable young fellow like me growing up in the north of England.
Did you find that realistic, obviously?
Well, it was realistic in as much as it showed... I mean, obviously, it's drama, it's fiction, but... So there are all kinds of things. Almost no police dramas are realistic, because a lot of police work would be completely, mind-numbingly boring for an audience, and it would also be, the way the police speak to each other and... particularly then, would be completely unacceptable for a non-police audience. The Sweeney was very realistic in that it showed a sort of... I think that it was 2 hard-working detectives who got a lot of prisoners, but were also drank a lot, smoked a lot, got into brawls, behaved reprehensibly. And it didn't make any bones about that. It showed that this was the effects of the job. It was really, really high-stress job. So yeah, that was realistic. I mean, it wasn't, but it's not all car chases and punch-ups. Yeah. Even then, it wasn't that. There was a lot more of it then than there is now. But, but I was starting to see the potential excitement of police fiction, police drama. And I remember one night I went to a terrible scene which I won't go into, in a block of flats in a tower block in Salford. It was the most dispiriting day of my entire police service. And afterwards, when it was when the world and his brother had arrived, too late, as we always were, I remember going up onto the roof to get a breath of fresh air, and it was about 2 or 3 in the morning, and I gazed across the sort of cityscape of Manchester. It was completely dark and silent, apart from this glimmering neon sign in the distance, Granada Television. And it reminded me of everything. Of my former life when I used to go with my dad to watch them making his TV shows, which they now felt as if there was an abyss between me and that part of my life. That all of that, and I thought, I want that. I want to go back to that. Right. And maybe I can use this. But it didn't happen that way straight away. But that's the first time I said to myself, I'm going to leave the cops and I'm going to do something in the world of entertainment. And it was a ludicrous ambition, because it was literally like, there was a joke on Monty Python. He wanted to go from being an accountant to being a lion tamer. Yeah. And they said, well, it's a bit of a leap, isn't it? This was the same thing.
Yeah.
I mean, there was no bridge in that era. But I mean, there may have been for one or two, but you couldn't just walk from one to the other. So I didn't realise what a long and difficult path I had ahead of me. But that was the moment I decided that I'm not going to be in this job for the next 30 years. I want to do something else.
So you mentioned before that your dad, Brian, is a scriptwriter, a very successful scriptwriter. You've grown up meeting these stars and so on.
Yeah.
Why was it that you still wanted to pursue the police? Why did the sort of the media aspect not appeal to you, or did you not think you need to go into that? Because it almost felt, to an outsider and to a listener, I think, well, you've got it made.
It should have been straightforward. Well, I mean, first of all, my dad was a freelance writer, so he couldn't give me a job. If he'd been, I don't know, the head of Granada, things might have been different, but he wasn't. He had to pitch for work just like I did. Just like I do now, he would certainly have been influential, but it's a world where you can't just be there because of nepotism. You have to demonstrate talent. Now, I had already started to put. I always wrote stories when I was at school. I loved doing it, but I wrote what I wanted to write, and I didn't particularly stick to the brief. So, for example, once when we were children, when I was at junior school, we went to Apolland College, which was the seminary at the time, to have a look around. I was at a Catholic school, and afterwards we all had to write about our day at Apolland College. I decided it was boring, so I brought Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde into my story, which raised a couple of eyebrows with my teachers. I was always a little bit indisciplined. I wrote what I wanted to write, and but I mean, that's a sort of humorous tale. It is true, but I had no real bearing on this. But what I probably wouldn't see. My dad wrote for shows like, ironically, Z Cars, which of course was a cop show. Yeah. But in the early days, Coronation Street was his big one. He went on years later to do all kinds of things, All Creatures Great and Small, Bergerac, and eventually won his BAFTA with Mr. Tom. But
that was John Thor's last appearance.
Yes, one of John's last things. Long before then, I'd sort of got it down as all being a bit boring, and I wanted to go out and be a copper and all this, and do all the things I've outlined. So there must have been a latent interest, though, because all of a sudden I suddenly became quite keen to be going to join my dad's world. Of course, I was still only in my 20s, so it's ridiculous to think, it's too late now. Though I did think that at the time. I thought, well, no, I've not really done any prep. I've not trained for any of this. But I was starting to talk to my dad about it quite a lot. And one evening, I came off shift. It was the early 80s, or the mid-80s, and The Bill had just started. The TV series, The Bill.
Yeah, it was around about 83, 84.
Yeah, I think it'd been on a couple of years. Yeah. I was still living at home at the time. I only got married in 88. I came in and I sat and watched it with them, and I very rarely did things like that, because shift work, you come in all kinds of strange hours. You very rarely sat and had tea with your mum and dad.
Yes, not a 9-to-5 job at all.
No, not at all. When you're young, you do all sorts of overtime, so it's, all kinds of strange hours you're coming and going. But I sat with them, and my dad commented that this was quite a good new police series, and that it prided itself on being very realistic. So I mean, you said, well, that's not realistic, and that's not realistic, and that's not realistic, and that's not realistic.
Day-to-day.
Yeah, but of course, The Bill, like all cop shows, wanted to create an air of authenticity, but they were very well aware that the real thing would have been boring. We have loads of live action, documentary, fly-on-the-wall cop things on telly now, but they're all edited down. The car chases are there, but the bits when you're writing it all up afterwards for 3 hours aren't.
Yeah, to fit it in a 50-minute piece with advert gaps.
And so, but my dad said to me, well, he challenged me. He said, well, if you think you can do any better, why don't you have a go? And so I thought about this, and I'd already had this Damascene moment when I'd seen this distant neon sign of Granada, like my future beckoning to me. It's ironic, really, because I never actually wrote for Granada, but it was a symbol.
It's a symbol of
what I wanted,
the future.
So when I wrote a few specimens, and I thought, I was completely naive. I thought, well, I'll write a script and my dad will show it to someone and they'll buy it and that'll be it. Yeah. Well, yeah, it doesn't happen like that. And first of all, I didn't know the first thing about writing scripts, so I looked at some of my dad's scripts and I copied them. I didn't copy them. The style and the layout.
Yeah.
I mean, now you have script writing software; it does it for you.
Yeah.
So I knew how to lay it out, but I didn't understand the first thing about pacing or anything like that. I wrote a number of specimen scripts, episodes of The Bill, just from watching it, with no character notes or anything to work from. And I sent them off.
You modelled it on the characters in the Bill?
I wrote about them.
Right.
Whether I was in breach of copyright or not, I don't know. But I sent it to them, to the Bill. I wasn't going to try and sell it to anybody else. And no one ever replied. And then about 6 or 7 months down the line, by this time, I was on the verge of leaving because I decided I had to go through it, if necessary, a circuitous route. So I had to get into a job where I was actually writing. So I was applying for trainee journalist jobs about that time.
So at this stage, your writing is definitely going to be something you want to do, without question.
By this time, I've really, really got keen on the idea. I've enjoyed the experience. I had 1,000 stories to tell. 1 week alone working in Manchester as a police officer in uniform or as a detective, you could tell 3 or 4 different stories that would make people's hair stand on end. So I thought, well, I can't waste. And of course, you knew other coppers who had even more outlandish experiences. Some 30-year guys would tell incredible stories. But I thought, well, I have to, I have to find my way into this by a normal route. But anyway, the point was, I started to, in effect, try to learn the discipline of writing. I finally got a journalist job, but at the same time, I wrote a screenplay called Knockoff Job, which was nothing to do with the Bill, but it was a police story. Right. And sent it to them again. They were at Wood Lane at the time in West London. And this time they replied and asked me if I'd go and see them. And I went to see one of the script editors there who, first of all, optioned Knockoff Job because he wanted to do. He was launching an independent production company.
An option being
they owned it for a certain period of time.
Right.
And they will try and get the development money to start a book, to turn it into an actual ongoing project. Mm-hmm. Now, an option. We've all got loads of things under option, but at the time I thought this was a major step forward. Yeah. I mean, all it really means is nobody else can do it. Mm-hmm. But it's a good thing to have because it means something. You never know, one of them might come off.
Yeah.
But he also asked me if I wanted to write for the Bill, so I said, yeah, sure. I'd love to. That's what I'm doing this for. So. But it was many years before I actually got on. I mean, what happened was I was coached. I then found myself being coached by what was at the time one of the best script departments in British television. I mean, The Bill was an ongoing TV series. It didn't have seasons. Well, it did, but not that the public were aware of because they overlapped. They ran on and on and on. And it wasn't a soap opera. Not at first. It was like every episode was a freestanding drama. Now, you think about that, and sometimes there were 3 a week. That's a phenomenal turnover. I mean, we used to do TV series like Play for Today and all that, which was seen as a hugely prestigious thing. The Bill was doing all that anyway,
And in a separate thing, it was a great vehicle for actors as well.
Great vehicle for actors.
I used to call it the Bill count, where you go to the theatre and you'd look at the programme of an actor, and it was, if they hadn't been in the Bill,
that's
then
right. The same applied to writers.
Right.
But I wrote for the Bill. Not all of my scripts got through, but a few did. By this time, I was also my day job. I was a journalist working in the Northwest.
Right. So you'd moved from.
I'd left the police now. I'd left by the 90s. I worked locally at the Wigan Observer, the Wigan Evening Post. I worked on the Rugby Leaguer and all this. Great time if you were a Wigan fan because they had an invincible team at the time. But also, then I went to Manchester and wasn't quite as keen. Apart from the fact by then I was really, really wanting to write full time.
With the change in jobs, though, because the police, obviously, the hours were crazy in terms of you couldn't have dedicated time to yourself. How did that apply from a journalism?
Well,
point of view?
the only problem with that was that by this time we had young children, and the Manchester paper I worked on was a daily, so I would get home sort of sometimes 9, half 9, and then I'd have to start writing the bill. My wife Catherine had 2 young children to deal with, and she was working too. So it's a good job our mums were both relatively young at the time, because it was one of these balancing acts: family life or work. There's no easy answer.
Many people face it.
There's no easy answer. I mean, it's neither is more virtuous than the other. They're both important things. But when I left the Bill around 2003, I had a fallout with them. I thought the world would be my oyster, but it wasn't. We were moving into a different era of television. All of a sudden, it wasn't just the BBC and ITV anymore. And that meant there was a lot more competition, and a lot fewer TV shows were being commissioned by network television in Britain.
Because you had Sky was coming more
all
prolific.
of that was coming online, and of course that brought a whole load of American writers, and I found I had a few lean years, I must admit. I mean, I had a remarkable experience. I mean, I'd probably had about 2 years where I hadn't earned a penny. This was the mid-2000s, and my wife Catherine, who was in the financial sector, was also struggling because we had the crash around that time. And I remember thinking the future looked bleak, frankly. And I was starting to look at journalist jobs again, which I really didn't want to do, because one thing that had happened since I'd been away is technology had come in. So that would mean I would think about going into a newsroom. It would be completely different from the newsroom I'd worked in. The newsroom I'd worked in had barely changed in 100 years. But this, something else. And I remember thinking, but I did start looking at. I started looking. I didn't apply widely. But then I was one quite desolate January morning. I remember I was in Tesco. We were shopping, and it was blizzarding sleet outside. Really added to the mood, and I didn't know what I was going to do. And we were walking, and I gravitated towards the sort of end where all the stationery was, and the magazines and the paperbacks. And my gaze fell on everything. Changed at this moment. I didn't realise it at the time. My eyes fell on the Doctor Who magazine, which was sitting on a rack.
Right.
And on the cover it said, "Call goes out for missing stories." And I thought, I wonder what that is. So I flipped through it, and it said that a company called Big Finish, who are very well respected now, had been starting to do original Doctor Who full cast audio dramas with older doctors and older companions. Nothing to do at that stage with the new Doctor Who, which was, on BBC television. And they were working their way through Colin Baker's 6th season. Colin was the 6th Doctor, I think. Not his 6th season, he was the 6th Doctor. And they were famously, that season was axed by the BBC. Now, if you're a Doctor Who fan, you'll know all about this. If you won't, it's simply the case that I think the BBC was getting very cold feet about Doctor Who in the early 80s. And I found this article fascinating because my dad had written a serial for Colin Baker called Leviathan, which had been part of that season. And
so this was a full Doctor Who series?
Yes, a full one, and it never got made. Even though a rehearsal script was produced and everything, it wasn't just a gleam in someone's eye. It was almost there, and they wanted that. Big Finish were very keen to get all these stories remade with Colin Baker and Nicola Bryant, who were the original stars, and there's full casts. And I thought, well, they can have Leviathan. I wonder why no one's contacted us. Well, it could have been to do with the fact my dad had been dead for 2 years by then, and I thought, I wonder if we've missed this boat. This could be very good for me, because and I'd seen the script, I'd seen it lying around, but I thought, what the hell is it? First of all, I had to get in touch with Big Finish, so I finally managed to do that, which took some doing. And I don't think they actually believed me when I told them what I had. And they asked me if there was an electronic version of the script, and I thought, well, it's 1984, so no, there isn't. Well, can you scan it and send it to us? I thought, well, I suppose I can do that. The problem I had then was, where was the damn thing? I went to my mum's little house, I looked through all her cupboards. We found Coronation Street, we found Hunter's Walk, we found Public Eye, we found the Squirrels. We found O&MD, all these classic TV shows. Could not find Doctor Who anywhere. And eventually a week passed, and I thought, well, I know I've seen it, but damned if I know where it is now. And I'm just going to have to accept the fact that it's gone. I'm going to have to drop them a line and say, look, I'm sorry, I can't find it. And I was really despondent because I'd really felt this was a turn of the tide moment for me career-wise, because I wasn't going to let them have it unless I could adapt it. And I was sitting in my office, and I'd written the email, and I turned in my chair one more time to look at the sort of wall of shelves behind me. Scanned, and I just, again, my gaze fell on this buff folder on the bottom shelf covered in dust. And I thought, all I can say is, I don't know what's in that folder. And I reached down and had a look, and it was Doctor Who Leviathan. Gosh, I could not believe it.
In plain sight.
All the time it had been there, right under my nose, and I was just about to cancel the whole thing. And I shouted so loudly, Kath ran upstairs, she thought I'd had an accident. I said, I found it. There were only like 3 pages missing.
Gosh.
And so I quickly scanned it and rattled it off to them. And they immediately came back, said they loved it. And yes, I had a track record, so they were going to trust me to do it, but it had to be done all in the next 2 weeks because they were right at the end of the schedule. So I just wrote the hell out of it. And it seemed to be a relatively brief time before we were actually in the studio down at Ladbroke Grove. And I met Colin Baker, who had known my dad from The Brothers. Dad wrote The Brothers in the early 70s, which was his big break into television.
Oh, was it? Right.
And Colin Baker was a most delightful guy, and very fond memories of The Brothers and my dad. And we went for a drink afterwards and to reminisce. And I always say that was the best day at work I ever spent. Absolutely fantastic. Great fun. Anyway, the thing was, everything seemed to change then, because I got regular work for Big Finish. And at the same time, my agent was saying, look, why don't you write a cop novel? And I was like, I don't know, I've done that. It's in the past, it's gone. I want to do science fiction. I want to do horror. I want to do fantasy. But my agent kept saying, look, it's a struggle. That outside the Doctor Who, there's not a lot being sold. Cop novels are out there. People are writing cop novels. And the big issue I had was I didn't want to do cosy crime. I found British crime very, very Village Greeny. And listen, that's got a market, one of the biggest markets on earth. I'm not knocking it, but it wasn't for me. And he said, well, go away and think hard about what you want to do. And at the time, there were 2 TV shows on, The Shield and The Wire, which were like real police shows. And I remember thinking, I want to do that. If I'm going to do it, it's got to be like that. So I wrote the first Heck book, Stalkers, which was very much of that sort of school of a cop that would stop at nothing to clear the streets.
Yes. And having just finished reading that first book,
right, yeah. Well, it became...
We'll talk about that in a bit.
Well, it was a bestseller, so the rest is history, as they say.
Yeah. Can I just just to go back to that journey then? So some of my listeners now, listening to this, will go, okay, so you've done that leap and you've been through various things. What was the biggest challenge in all that time from you going from that full-time work to having that leap of faith? So obviously the script, the Doctor Who script's been a driver behind that, but how did you cope with that mentally?
Well, the leap of faith is a good phrase to use, because there comes a time in every person who wants to write's career when they have to leave the day job and branch out on their own. Now, I was spared that leap of faith, or rather that leap into the darkness, because I was made redundant. It wasn't my choice. Right. And at the time, my wife, I hadn't been there long enough to get any kind of payout. I got a payout, but it wasn't much. And my wife supported me because she knew this was really what I wanted to do. Right. So the biggest moment we all face, you can do both at the same time, but it becomes a killing workload. And one will always suffer at the expense of the other. And the more I was throwing myself into writing, the more I was conscious that I wasn't perhaps doing my best job during the day, my best work during the day. Right. So, don't get me wrong, some of the bosses I've had, I wouldn't have cared less about that. But there were others who I did want to do a good job.
There's a lot of people resonating with that, I'm sure.
But there were some people who were good, and I felt bad that I felt that I was not really fulfilling my, what they required of me. I mean, don't get me wrong, I wasn't doing slack work, but the enthusiasm wasn't there.
Yeah. So it was a moment of truth, really, that drove that.
I mean, but you always have to. The problem you have, I suppose, with any craft, I guess it's particularly anything in the arts. There's only so much you can learn and be taught. If you haven't got what it takes, I'm not sure what else you can do about that. There are some people who, for example, I could never create a painting. If I tried, it would look like something done from in a junior school. I would love to be able to paint, but there's no point in me even trying because put it this way, it will be a very, very, very long road with probably almost no returns. So you have to accept that possibility that you might not ever be able to do it. And people could go on creative writing courses and all that, but there are certain things that you cannot. Some people are good at some things and not so good at others. Do you know what I mean? You sometimes have to accept that.
Yeah.
But I do think that there's a lot you can learn. But you're always going to be taking a risk. If you're packing your day job in, you're always going to be taking a risk that your sales might never, ever justify such a drastic move. That's the moment of mental torment that we all have to go through.
In the second part of my interview with Paul, which you can hear in the next episode, we go on to discuss the writing process in detail and how to manage writing in various styles and genres, amongst other topics. Despite having a father who is recognised as one of the most successful TV scriptwriters in the last 50 years, he initially chose to go down a completely different career path. That said, I bet you, like me, can think of people who have purposely set out to do something completely different to their parents. It does seem that the lure of the Granada TV experience was obviously deep-rooted in him from a very early age, though, and has undoubtedly helped inspire his motivation and creativity. It was also good to learn that, like many of us, he had a tough balancing act to do between the day job, pursuing a creative passion, and juggling all of that with family life. I wonder how many of you listening right now are at that early stage. If so, do make sure that you listen to part 2, in which you'll be able to learn how to hone your creative skills and hopefully, like Paul, be able to do this as a full-time profession, should you wish to do so. If you're just looking for ideas on how to develop your craft, then the next part is also essential listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please follow the series wherever you get your pods and do review the back catalogue if you're new to the series. You can leave feedback about the episode through social media by searching for Half Hour Mentor or via the email link in the show notes. I'd love to know what you think of these episodes, so please do get in touch. Thanks very much for listening, and until next time, bye for now.